Sean "Diddy" Combs is asking a federal appeals court in New York to overturn his conviction on prostitution-related charges and order his immediate release, or alternatively reduce his 4-year sentence. Combs, 56, is currently serving a 50-month prison term in New Jersey after being convicted in July on 2 counts of transportation for prostitution under the Mann Act. Jurors acquitted him of the more serious racketeering and sex-trafficking charges. In their filing with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, his attorneys argued that the sentence was unfairly harsh because the trial judge, Arun Subramanian, improperly relied on evidence tied to charges on which Combs was acquitted. They contend the judge acted like a 13th juror by incorporating allegations of coercion and exploitation that the jury had rejected. Balance scale, key arguments in the appeal. Excessive sentence. Combs's lawyers say typical Mann Act convictions without coercion result in less than 15 months, making his 50-month term unprecedentedly severe. Improper findings. They argue the judge's statements that Combs coerced and exploited former partners inflated the punishment despite the jury rejecting those claims. Relief requested. The appeal asks the court to vacate the conviction, order immediate release, or send the case back for resentencing without considering acquitted. Conduct. Calendar next steps. The government has until February 20th to respond. Combs's team will file a reply by March 13. Oral arguments have not yet been scheduled. Magnifying glass tilted left broader context. This filing marks another chapter in Combs's high-profile legal battle, which has drawn intense media attention and public debate. Legal analysts note that while challenges to the use of acquitted conduct at sentencing are significant, success is far from guaranteed. The outcome may hinge on whether the appeals court agrees that the judge exceeded her authority. Combs is currently scheduled for release in May 2028 if the conviction and sentence stand. Diddy's shocking holiday appeal, a Christmas gambit for freedom, and the last-minute legal battle filed on Christmas Eve. A Christmas Behind Bars, December 24, 2024. While most Americans prepared for Christmas morning, wrapping presents, preparing meals, gathering with family, Sean "Diddy" Combs sat in his cell at the Federal Correctional Institution in Fort Dix, New Jersey. Outside, his legal team worked frantically, putting finishing touches on what they hoped would be his ticket to freedom. At 11:47 p.m., just minutes before Christmas Day, they filed their motion with the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. The timing was strategic, dramatic, and controversial. Classic Diddy, even from behind bars. But would this last-minute holiday Hail Mary succeed, or would it be seen as a desperate act by a man running out of options? This is the story of that appeal, the arguments within it, and what it reveals about justice, power, and the American legal system. The 11th hour filing. The strategic timing. The decision to file on Christmas Eve was no accident. Diddy's legal team, led by the formidable Jennifer Martinez, believed the timing would maximize impact. The media angle. Slow news cycle during holidays means more attention to dramatic filings. The Christmas timing creates a sympathetic narrative. A man separated from family during the holidays forces the prosecution to respond during their own holiday time, potentially rushing their reply. The pressure tactic. Shows the court this matter is urgent, demonstrates Diddy's team is working around the clock, creates momentum heading into the new year. The public relations play. Reminds the public Diddy is still fighting, keeps his name in headlines when other stories dominate, frames him as someone unfairly imprisoned during a time of family and forgiveness. But the timing also carried risks. Some might see it as grandstanding, as using the holidays for publicity rather than genuine legal need. The prosecution would certainly characterize it that way. Inside the filing. The 247-page brief filed with the Second Circuit represents months of work, thousands of billable hours, and what Diddy's team believes is their strongest case yet for his release. The cover letter. The filing begins with an unusual personal touch, a letter from Diddy himself, written from his prison cell. As I write this on Christmas Eve, separated from my children and mother, I'm forced to reflect on how I arrived at this place. I've made mistakes in my life. I've been demanding, difficult, and at times thoughtless about how my actions affected others. But I am not the person the prosecution painted at trial, and I am not guilty of the crimes for which I've been imprisoned. This appeal is not just about my freedom. It's about fundamental fairness in our justice system. It's about whether a judge can punish someone for things a jury specifically said they didn't do. It's about whether celebrity status means harsher treatment rather than equal justice under law. I ask the court to carefully consider the arguments my lawyers present. I ask for a fair review of what happened at sentencing. And I ask to be home with my family while that review takes place. Respectfully submitted, Sean Combs. This personal touch is unusual in appellate briefs and represents a calculated risk, making the case personal rather than purely legal. The core legal arguments. Argument 1. Judge Arun as the 13th juror. The centerpiece of the appeal is a scathing attack on Judge Arun's conduct at sentencing. The defense argues she essentially overruled the jury's verdict by basing her sentence on acquitted conduct. The timeline of contradiction. The brief lays out a detailed comparison. Issue. Jury finding. Judge Arun's sentencing statement. Racketeering/criminal enterprise. Not guilty. Jury rejected this theory. Pattern of exploitative behavior across multiple victims. Modern slavery trafficking. Not guilty. Jury found insufficient evidence. Systematic coercion and control over vulnerable women. Force, fraud, coercion. Not alleged in convicted counts. Used power and wealth to force compliance. Nature of relationships. Jury convicted only on transportation charges. These were not relationships. They were exploitation. The legal argument. The defense cites the Sixth Amendment right to trial by jury and argues that allowing a judge to override jury findings at sentencing essentially nullifies that constitutional right. The jury heard weeks of testimony. They saw every piece of evidence. They heard from every witness. And they made their decision. Mr. Combs was not guilty of operating a criminal enterprise, not guilty of modern slavery trafficking, not guilty of the systematic exploitation the government alleged. Yet at sentencing, Judge Arun made clear she believed all of those things anyway. She said explicitly that she found a pattern of coercion and abuse, despite the jury rejecting that theory. She imposed a sentence based on conduct the jury said didn't happen or couldn't be proven. This is not a close call or a subtle issue. The judge literally said, "I know the jury acquitted on these charges, but I'm going to sentence as if they had convicted." She appointed herself the 13th juror and overruled the 12 citizens who actually heard the case. This cannot stand. If it does, the right to trial by jury is meaningless. Any judge could simply impose their own view of the facts regardless of the verdict, making the entire trial process a theatrical exercise with no real consequence. Argument 2. Grossly disproportionate sentence. The second major argument attacks the length of the sentence as wildly out of proportion with similar cases. The comparison table. The brief includes an extensive appendix comparing Diddy's sentence to others convicted under similar circumstances. Case. Charges. Circumstances. Sentence. United States v. Rodriguez, 2019. 2 counts Mann Act. Transported 2 women across state lines. 14 months. United States v. Chun, 2020. 3 counts Mann Act. Transported 3 women, including financial control. 18 months. United States v. Patterson, 2021. 2 counts Mann Act, 1 count wire fraud. Transportation plus financial fraud. 24 months. United States v. Williams, 2022. 4 counts Mann Act. Multiple victims over 3 years. 30 months. United States v. Combs, 2024. 2 counts Mann Act. Transportation, NO force/fraud/coercion. 50 months. The statistical argument. Over the past decade, the median sentence for Mann Act violations without enhancements for force, fraud, minors, or trafficking has been 16 months. The average is 19 months. Mr. Combs received 50 months, 263% of the average sentence and 312% of the median. This is not a reasonable upward variance. This is not a judge exercising appropriate discretion. This is punishment specifically and explicitly enhanced because the defendant is famous, wealthy, and powerful. The judge said as much, emphasizing his position and influence and the need to send a message to others in his industry. But the law does not permit celebrity sentencing. Justice must be blind, not calibrated based on the defendant's profile. Mr. Combs should receive the same sentence anyone else would for the same conduct, not triple the typical sentence because a judge wants to make an example of him. Argument 3. Violation of due process. The third major argument focuses on procedural violations during sentencing. The evidentiary issues. The defense identifies several problems with how evidence was presented at sentencing. Hearsay upon hearsay. The judge relied on pre-sentence investigation reports that contained multiple layers of hearsay, violating confrontation rights, unreliable victim statements. Statements from individuals who didn't testify at trial were given weight without opportunity for cross-examination. Media reports. The pre-sentence report allegedly included references to media coverage and public allegations that were never proven in court. Acquitted conduct. As discussed extensively above, the judge relied primarily on conduct the jury specifically rejected. The constitutional violation. The Fifth Amendment guarantees due process before deprivation of liberty. This requires that sentencing be based on reliable evidence, proven to an appropriate standard, with opportunity for the defendant to confront and challenge that evidence. None of those requirements were met here. Mr. Combs was sentenced based on unreliable hearsay and proven allegations and conduct a jury found he didn't commit. The process was fundamentally unfair and violated his constitutional rights. Argument 4. The request for immediate release. The final section of the brief argues that Diddy should be released immediately while the appeal proceeds. The substantial question argument. This appeal presents substantial questions of law that have not been definitively resolved by the Second Circuit. Can a sentencing judge rely primarily on acquitted conduct when imposing an upward variance? While some precedent allows consideration of acquitted conduct, no case permits it to be the primary or sole basis for a dramatically enhanced sentence. What limits exist on celebrity sentencing? The Second Circuit has never addressed whether a judge can explicitly enhance a sentence based on the defendant's fame and the desire to send a message to others. What due process protections apply at sentencing? The evolving standards for reliability of evidence at sentencing present ongoing constitutional questions. These are serious legal issues with legitimate arguments on both sides. While this court considers them, Mr. Combs should not languish in prison. The proposed conditions. To address flight risk and public safety concerns, the defense proposes extraordinary conditions. $100 million bonds secured by real property, house arrest with 24/7 GPS monitoring, surrender of all passports, U.S. and any international travel documents, no contact with any alleged victims or witnesses, daily check-ins with pretrial services, restriction to Manhattan residents with no travel beyond 50-mile radius, without court approval, surrender of all firearms, though none are registered to him, no access to private aircraft or watercraft, monitoring of all financial transactions above $10,000, prohibition on destroying evidence or tampering with witnesses. These conditions make flight impossible and protect public safety while allowing Mr. Combs to contribute to society, support his family, and actively participate in preparing his defense rather than sitting in a cell for years while these substantial legal questions are resolved. Judge Arun under fire. Who is Judge Priya Arun? To understand the controversy, we need to understand the judge at the center of it. Background. Judge Priya Arun was appointed to the federal bench 8 years ago after a distinguished career as a prosecutor and brief stint in private practice. At 52, she's known for tough but fair rulings, no tolerance for abuse of power, particular sensitivity to cases involving exploitation of women, lengthy, detailed sentencing explanations, relatively harsh sentences compared to other judges in the district. Her judicial philosophy. In past cases, Judge Arun has been clear about her approach. Sentencing is not a mathematical exercise. It requires considering the whole person, their conduct, their impact on victims, their likelihood of reoffending, and the message sent to society. I take seriously my responsibility to impose sentences that are sufficient but not greater than necessary to achieve the purposes of sentencing. Controversial past decisions. This isn't the first time Judge Arun has faced criticism for harsh sentences. United States v. Morrison, 2020 sentenced a white-collar criminal to 8 years when guidelines suggested 3 to 4 years, citing his abuse of trust. United States v. Jackson, 2021 imposed maximum sentence on a first-time drug offender, calling his role in the organization particularly culpable. United States v. Peterson, 2023 sentenced a domestic abuser to 10 years despite a plea agreement recommending 6, saying the agreement didn't adequately reflect the harm. In each case, appellate courts upheld her sentences, finding she had acted within her discretion. But her track record shows a pattern of imposing sentences at the high end of permissible ranges, particularly in cases involving abuse of power or exploitation. The sentencing hearing. A detailed look. To understand the defense's accusations, we need to examine exactly what Judge Arun said at sentencing. Her statement lasted over 45 minutes and left no doubt about her views. Opening statement. Mr. Combs, we are here today because a jury of your peers found you guilty of 2 violations of the Mann Act. You were acquitted of other charges, and I respect the jury's verdict. However, my responsibility at sentencing is broader than simply the convicted counts. I must consider the whole picture of your conduct and its impact. This opening already signaled what was coming. The judge would go beyond the convicted offenses. The pattern discussion. While the jury acquitted you of racketeering and modern slavery trafficking, I cannot ignore the pattern of behavior described by multiple witnesses. I heard from women who described strikingly similar experiences, promises of opportunity that became situations where they felt controlled, exploited, and afraid to leave. Was each individual incident proven beyond a reasonable doubt to constitute trafficking? The jury said no, and I accept that. But does the totality of the testimony establish a pattern of using power and influence to manipulate vulnerable women? I find that it does, and I may consider that pattern in determining an appropriate sentence. The acquitted conduct. The defense will argue I cannot consider acquitted conduct. But the law is clear. At sentencing, I may consider relevant conduct proven by a preponderance of the evidence, which is a lower standard than the beyond reasonable doubt requirement for conviction. Just because the government couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you operated a racketeering enterprise doesn't mean I must ignore evidence of a pattern. Just because they couldn't prove modern slavery trafficking doesn't mean I must ignore testimony about coercion and control. The power dynamic. What troubles me most is the abuse of power and position. You were not just another person engaging in criminal conduct. You are someone with enormous wealth, influence, and control over others' careers and livelihoods. You used that position to exploit vulnerable people who felt they had no choice but to comply. This isn't about your fame or success. This is about accountability being proportional to power. When someone with your level of influence engages in criminal conduct, the impact is greater and the need for deterrence is stronger. The sentence. Therefore, considering the nature and circumstances of the offense, the history and characteristics of a defendant, the need for deterrence, and the need to protect the public, I sentence you to 50 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The defense's counterargument. Diddy's lawyers argue every aspect of this reasoning was improper. On pattern evidence, Judge Arun repeatedly referenced a pattern the jury explicitly rejected. The racketeering charge was specifically about a pattern of criminal conduct. The jury said, "No, we don't find that pattern." The judge said, "Well, I find it anyway." This is exactly the 13th juror problem we've identified. On acquitted conduct. While it's technically true that judges may consider some acquitted conduct at sentencing, that cannot be the primary basis for the sentence. Here, the judge spent 90% of her sentencing statement discussing conduct the jury acquitted on. The convicted offenses were almost an afterthought. This goes far beyond what precedent allows. On celebrity status. The judge explicitly said she was sentencing him more harshly because of his position and influence and the need to send a message to his industry. This is the definition of celebrity sentencing, imposing punishment not for the crime, but for who the defendant is. Equal justice under law means a CEO and a clerk get the same sentence for the same crime. The prosecution's anticipated response. The government's position. Though prosecutors haven't filed their formal response yet, they have 30 days. Court watchers expect their arguments to include. On the sentencing, Judge Arun followed established law. She was entitled to consider all relevant conduct at sentencing, and she applied the correct legal standards. The defense disagrees with her factual findings, but disagreement doesn't equal legal error. The sentence is within the statutory maximum and represents a reasonable exercise of judicial discretion. The judge adequately explained her reasoning, considered the relevant factors, and imposed a sentence tailored to this specific defendant and his specific conduct. On acquitted conduct, the Supreme Court has repeatedly held that sentencing judges may consider acquitted conduct. The burden of proof at sentencing is preponderance of evidence, not beyond reasonable doubt. Judge Arun made clear she was applying the correct standard. The defense wants to relitigate the facts of the case, but the time for that was at trial. The jury made its decision, and now the judge made hers based on the evidence she found credible. That's how the system works. On proportionality, the defense cherry-picks cases for comparison. When you look at cases involving defendants with similar power and influence who abuse their positions, Mr. Combs' sentence is entirely reasonable. Moreover, the Mann Act cases cited by the defense typically involve defendants who fully admitted guilt, showed remorse, and cooperated with authorities. Mr. Combs has done none of these things. He continues to maintain he did nothing wrong and characterizes his victims as liars. This lack of acceptance of responsibility justifies a longer sentence. On release pending appeal? Absolutely not. Mr. Combs presents both a flight risk and a danger to the community. His wealth gives him the means to flee, and his history suggests he hasn't learned from this conviction. The appeal doesn't present genuinely substantial questions. It presents disagreements with well-established law. Release should be reserved for extraordinary circumstances, and this isn't that case. The missing victim voices. What's notable in the prosecution's anticipated response is what will likely be missing: extensive discussion of victim impact. The complication. The two women whose cases led to conviction have largely retreated from public view. Neither has made statements about the appeal. This creates a challenge for prosecutors. They can't speak for victims without their permission. The victims may be exhausted and want to move on. Public statements could be seen as pressuring victims, but without victim voices, the justice argument is weakened. The advocate statement. A victims' rights organization did release a statement. We are deeply troubled by Mr. Combs' continued attempts to minimize his conduct and attack the judge who sentenced him. The women who came forward showed tremendous courage. They deserve to see justice carried out, not endless appeals that re-traumatize them and question the verdict they worked so hard to achieve. We urge the appeals court to carefully consider the impact of releasing Mr. Combs on the women who testified against him and the message it would send to other victims considering whether to come forward. Inside Fort Dix, Diddy's prison life. The facility. The Federal Correctional Institution at Fort Dix is a low-security facility in New Jersey, about 70 miles from New York City. It houses approximately 3,800 inmates and is known for its relatively good conditions compared to higher security facilities. Why Fort Dix? Diddy was designated to Fort Dix for several reasons. Security level. As a nonviolent offender with no prior record, he qualified for low-security location, relatively close to New York, allowing family visits programs, offers educational and vocational programs. Population, houses many white-collar and nonviolent offenders. Daily life. For someone who lived in luxury penthouses and traveled by private jet, prison life is a jarring adjustment. Daily schedule. 5:30 a.m. Wake-up call and count 6:00 a.m. Breakfast in the dining hall 7:30 a.m. Work assignment. Diddy reportedly works in the prison library 12:00 p.m. Lunch and brief recreation time 1:00 p.m. Return to work or educational programs 5:00 p.m. Dinner 6:00 p.m. Recreation yard time. Weather permitting 8:30 p.m. Return to housing unit 10:00 p.m. Lights out. Living conditions. Shared cell with one or two other inmates. Basic furnishings. Bunk beds, small desk, Toilet/sink combo limited personal property allowed prison-issued clothing no internet access, limited phone privileges commissary access for approved items. The adjustment, according to sources close to the situation. Initial period. The first few weeks were rough. He's someone who is used to controlling every aspect of his environment, and suddenly he controls nothing. The loss of autonomy is the hardest part for someone like him. Current status. He's adapted better than expected. Initially, there was a lot of curiosity and some inmates trying to befriend him for bragging rights. But he's kept to himself. There's been no trouble, no conflict. He's doing his time quietly. The holiday season. This will be Diddy's first Christmas behind bars, which adds emotional weight to the timing of the appeal. Family visits. His mother visited on December 23 rd. Several of his children are scheduled to visit during the holiday week. Phone calls are scheduled for Christmas Day, limited to 15 minutes. Holiday programs. Fort Dix offers some holiday programming. Special Christmas meal, religious services for various faiths, limited recreation activities, ability to send holiday cards, though incoming, outgoing mail is monitored. The psychological impact. A prison psychology expert explained. Holidays in prison are particularly difficult. Everyone else is celebrating with family, exchanging gifts, enjoying freedom. Meanwhile, you're counted 5 times a day and eating from a tray. For someone like Combs, who's used to throwing legendary parties, the contrast is profound. The PR battle, controlling the narrative. Even from prison, Diddy is fighting to control the public narrative about his case. The media strategy. His PR team has implemented a multi-pronged approach. Selective interviews, approved family members and supporters speaking to sympathetic outlets, social media management, carefully curated posts on his accounts, managed by his team, legal commentary, his lawyers doing media appearances to explain the appeal, celebrity support, encouraging industry friends to speak out. The challenge. But prison makes this difficult. He can't directly control the message. Every communication is monitored. He can't respond in real time to developments. The conviction itself undermines his credibility. The competing narratives. Team Diddy's message. Sean Combs is a victim of an overzealous prosecution, a biased judge, and a justice system that treats celebrities more harshly. He was acquitted of the most serious charges, yet sentenced as if convicted of all of them. He's being punished not for what he did, but for who he is. This is fundamentally unjust, and the appeal will correct it. The prosecution's message. Mr. Combs was convicted by a jury after a fair trial. He abused his power and position to exploit vulnerable women. The judge properly considered all relevant evidence and imposed an appropriate sentence. His appeals are a wealthy defendant using expensive lawyers to avoid accountability. The victim's advocate message. This case is about women who were brave enough to come forward against a powerful man. The verdict vindicated them, and the sentence provides some measure of justice. The endless appeals re-traumatize victims and suggest that wealth can buy your way out of consequences. Public opinion. Polls show the public remains divided. 38% believe Diddy's sentence is appropriate or too lenient. 29% believe it's too harsh given the acquittals. 33% are unsure or don't know enough to judge. Demographic breakdowns show interesting patterns. Age. Younger people more likely to support the sentence. Gender. Women more likely to view it as appropriate. Race. Black Americans more divided, with some seeing it as justice and others as disproportionate treatment. Politics. Conservatives slightly more likely to support the sentence. Progressives divided between accountability and sentencing reform priorities. The broader legal context. The acquitted conduct debate. Diddy's case has thrust a controversial sentencing practice into the spotlight. Understanding the issue requires some legal background. The history. Federal sentencing guidelines, adopted in the 1980s, aim to reduce disparities in sentencing. Judges were required to consider relevant conduct, not just the convicted offense but related behavior. Over time, courts interpreted this to include acquitted conduct, reasoning that the standard of proof is different, preponderance versus beyond reasonable doubt. Sentencing requires considering the full context. Judges need discretion to impose appropriate sentences. The controversy. Critics argue this practice undermines the jury's role, makes acquittal meaningless, violates the spirit, if not the letter, of the Sixth Amendment, allows judges to circumvent the high burden of proof for criminal conviction. Supporters contend judges need full information to impose appropriate sentences. The different standards of proof justify the practice. It prevents defendants from gaming the system by getting lucky on some charges. Recent developments. Several Supreme Court justices have expressed skepticism about acquitted conduct sentencing. Justice Kavanaugh wrote in a 2021 opinion, "Acquitted conduct sentencing raises grave concerns. It seems inconsistent with the jury trial right and the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt." But the court hasn't definitively ruled the practice unconstitutional. Diddy's case could be a vehicle for that ruling. The celebrities' sentencing question. Another issue brought into focus is whether celebrities are treated differently. The arguments for harsher treatment. Greater deterrent effect. When famous people are punished, they have more resources to avoid accountability, so sentences must be stronger. Their crimes have broader impact due to their platform and influence. They should be held to higher standards given their position as role models. The arguments against. Equal justice under law means the same treatment regardless of status. Sentencing shouldn't be about sending messages to others. Enhanced sentences for famous defendants violate equal protection. The law should punish conduct, not status. The data. Research on celebrity sentencing shows mixed results. Some studies suggest celebrities get lighter sentences due to better lawyers and public sympathy. Other studies find harsher sentences due to judges wanting to show they're not swayed. The truth likely varies case by case. Diddy's explicit 50-month sentence, when similar cases average 16 to 19 months, provides concrete data suggesting harsh treatment in his case. The Mann Act's continued relevance. The case also raises questions about whether the Mann Act remains appropriate in modern contexts. Original purpose. The 1910 law was designed to combat forced prostitution and modern slavery trafficking, particularly of young women and girls brought from other countries or transported across state lines. Modern application. Today, the Mann Act is primarily used in genuine trafficking cases, but it can also apply to consensual adult relationships where financial support is exchanged, raising questions about whether such relationships should be criminalized, how to distinguish dating with financial support from prostitution, whether the law is applied consistently or selectively. Reform proposals. Some legal scholars have suggested narrowing the Mann Act to focus on clear trafficking cases requiring proof of coercion or exploitation, decriminalizing consensual adult conduct, updating the law to reflect modern relationships and modern slavery work debates. Diddy's case, where the jury acquitted on trafficking but convicted on transportation, highlights these definitional challenges. What happens next? The appellate timeline. Understanding what comes next requires understanding appellate procedure. Immediate steps. Government response due January 25, 2025. Prosecution files their opposition to the appeal. Will address each argument made by the defense. Will oppose immediate release. Defense reply due February 10, 2025. Diddy's team responds to government's arguments. Last chance to make their case before oral arguments. Oral arguments scheduled March-April 2025. Each side gets 15 to 30 minutes before three-judge panel. Judges ask questions, probe weaknesses. Lawyers must think on their feet. Decision expected May. July 2025. Panel issues written decision. Could come sooner or later depending on case complexity. Possible outcomes. 1. Affirm everything. Conviction stands. Sentence stands. Diddy continues serving time. Can petition for Supreme Court review. Unlikely to be granted. 2. Affirm conviction. Vacate sentence. Trial was fair but sentence was improper. Case sent back to Judge Arun or a different judge for resentencing. Most likely outcome if defense wins anything. 3. Reverse conviction. Trial had reversible error. Charges dismissed or new trial ordered. Unlikely but possible. 4. Partial relief. One conviction overturned. Other stands. Requires resentencing on remaining count. The bail decision. The request for immediate release will be decided separately and more quickly. Timeline. Government response. 2 weeks. Panel decision. 2-4 weeks after response. Total time could be decided by mid to late January. Likelihood. Legal experts rate the chances of bail pending appeal as low. Professor Sarah Chun, NYU Law. maybe 10 to 15% chance. The bar is very high for release pending appeal, and Diddy hasn't demonstrated the kind of extraordinary circumstances courts look for. Former prosecutor James Rodriguez: I'd be shocked if they grant this. The sentence is within the statutory maximum. The judge explained her reasoning, and he was convicted by a jury. The appeal raises interesting questions, but not the kind of substantial questions that justify release. Defense attorney Maria Santos: It's a long shot, but stranger things have happened. If the panel is troubled by the acquitted conduct issue, they might grant release while they consider it. But I wouldn't bet on it. Wild card scenarios. Several unexpected developments could change everything. New evidence. If Diddy's investigators uncover exculpatory evidence or proof of prosecutorial misconduct, that could change the calculus. But this is rare in appeals. Prosecutorial error. If evidence emerges that prosecutors violated rules or withheld evidence, that could force a new trial. Again, this is uncommon. Supreme Court ruling. If the Supreme Court rules on acquitted conduct sentencing in another case before Diddy's appeal is decided, that could dramatically affect his case, for better or worse. Health crisis. If Diddy develops serious health issues in prison, that could create grounds for compassionate release separate from the appeal. Political pressure. In theory, a presidential pardon or commutation is possible, though extremely unlikely in a case like this. Neither current nor likely future administrations have incentive to intervene. The human toll on Diddy and his family. The children. Diddy has 6 children from various relationships, ranging in age from teenagers to adults. The impact on them has been profound. Public scrutiny and judgment complicated feelings about their father, practical challenges of maintaining relationship during incarceration, long-term questions about how this shapes their lives. One of his adult children posted on social media: The hardest part is holding all these truths at once. He's my dad, and I love him. He's made mistakes and hurt people. The legal system reached a verdict. I'm trying to figure out what it means to be loyal to family while also acknowledging harm. There's no guidebook for this. The mother, Janice Combs, 83, has been her son's most steadfast supporter. She attended every day of the trial, visits regularly, and maintains his innocence. Sources say the stress has affected her health. She's aged years and months. The worry, the public nature of it all, the pain of seeing her son imprisoned, it's taken a real toll. The extended family. Others in Diddy's orbit face their own challenges. Former business partners trying to distance themselves, artists who worked with him trying to navigate complicated loyalty, friends forced to choose sides, employees whose livelihoods depended on his empire. On the victims. While they've largely retreated from public view, the 2 women whose cases led to conviction continue to deal with the aftermath. Ongoing challenges. Healing from trauma. While the case remains in headlines, privacy violations as media continues to dig into their lives, the appeal forcing them to relive everything, uncertainty about whether the verdict will stand, judgment from those who don't believe them. A trauma therapist who works with abuse survivors explained: For victims, the criminal case is just one chapter. They're dealing with years of psychological impact that don't end when a verdict is read. Every appeal, every motion, every headline is a reminder. Many victims say the legal process is re-traumatizing in its own right. The advocacy question. Some victims' rights advocates have criticized how the prosecution has handled victim communication during the appeal. These women deserve to be kept informed and have their voices heard in the process. They should learn about major developments from Twitter. On the broader community, the case has affected countless others. Other victims, women who had similar experiences, but whose cases weren't prosecuted.